Okay, ladies and gentlemen, don't panic. But I've just received word that Kirk Cousins might not show up for voluntary offseason workouts. What do we do? What do we do?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, been podcasting for over a decade. Formerly the Falcons Fans Podcast, now the Locked On Falcons Podcast. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that stay strong with me each and every day. As everydayers, that means you make your podcast, this podcast, your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are joined by the head honcho of the Falcoholic, Dave Choate, who's also been covering the Falcons for almost 2 decades. Over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And we'll be talking about if the Falcons zig while we expect them to zag in this upcoming draft. Could all that money that they spent this offseason on special teams actually pay off now, given some of the rule changes that have been announced at the league meetings today? And is the Falcons' current situation or solution at the nickel cornerback position already on the roster? But first, we got to talk about Kirk Cousins. Oh boy, don't we love talking about Kirk Cousins? And so there had been previous reports that Kirk Cousins was expected to skip voluntary workouts, and that seemingly was confirmed today at the league meeting when Raheem Morse spoke to various reporters, basically saying he does not expect Kirk to show up for the voluntary portion of things. Dave, my friend, what are your thoughts on hearing that news?
At this point, anything short of him like getting traded or retiring and taking up a new career is just not moving the needle for me. Like I'm like, sure, okay. If is he not going to show up to mandatory minicamp too? Like that's kind of interesting, but also I think at this point my expectations are that he's not going to be on this roster by the time that matters. And maybe expectation is intermingled with hope here, rather than it's definitely going to happen. But I think where I'm at with that is I understand he does not want to be on this roster as a backup. I would be surprised if he was going to kind of play ball to that extent if he is still on this roster. Where he's been spotted in random Ohio Chipotles at this point. Hopefully that's a bellwether that by May he's a Cleveland Brown or something, so that we don't have to keep talking about and thinking about what Kirk Cousins might be doing during voluntary OTAs and the like. So I that's kind of where I stand on it. Is if we are in June and he's still here and that becomes more relevant, I think we'll have plenty to talk about then, because the Falcons may still have him as their backup and not have a third quarterback on the roster that, if they do flip him, would make sense to have around. But at the moment, I'm interested in who's going to replace him and when he's going to
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't feel like talking about Kirk Cousins, so I'm glad I had you on the show, Dave, to talk about Kirk Cousins on today's episode. So we'll see what's what with that. As Dave just said, like, yeah, I think the mandatory part of offseason is, I believe, in June. So the plan, we'll see if the plan comes to fruition. The plan is that Kirk's gonna be long gone by that point, but we'll see if that happens. But I think a little bit more relevant news for this upcoming season with a player that is on the Falcons roster and probably will remain on the Falcons roster at least past June is Clark Phillips. And Raheem Morris said that maybe he's going to get some run as possibly the nickel cornerback this year. And so I'm just curious, do you feel like Clark Phillips is plan A at the nickel cornerback, or is he just kind of a placeholder before the Falcons address that presumably in the draft or later this offseason?
I tend to think he is plan A, and I think that because the Falcons have really not done anything on the veteran route to challenge him, and I know they could do that via the draft, but I'm not sure if they're going to want to draft a guy and install him as their starting nickel corner out of the gate. I think whatever Raheem says about, Mike Hughes can play inside, we kind of saw that in 2023. I wasn't a huge fan of that during the times we saw it. So to me, Phillips clearly has talent. I do think the coaching staff likes him. They just were very, very reluctant, seemingly, to play him at the nickel a year ago. But perhaps with a full off season to focus on that, D. Alford seemingly out of the picture, not likely to be an immediate draft priority. I would expect them to be looking to supplant Hughes as a starter outside before they attack the nickel. So to me, Phillips kind of makes sense as plan A there, and I do tend to think in this particular instance it's maybe not just talk.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be curious. I will be disappointed if the Falcons do not invest one of their premium picks in a corner this draft. But I do think, as you mentioned, and Raheem Morris mentioned this, because of the presence of Mike Hughes, like that could be an outside corner, and then you could bump Hughes inside, and that could be a nickel corner, and Mike Hughes can stay outside where, as you mentioned, his best football has been played. I've always been a proponent of the idea that Clark Phillips would either make it as a nickel or not really make it in this league. He's obviously spent the bulk of his time playing outside corner for the Falcons these last 2 seasons. He has gotten extensive preseason reps at the nickel cornerback spot, but whether that translates to him being the starter, we'll have to sort of see. So, a competition between him and Natron Brooks, to me, makes sense. I would like to have a third option added into that mix than rather just and no Mike Ford not being that third option. So I would like to see the Falcons at least get another body in that cornerback room to at least push for whether that's an outside spot or the nickel spot. We'll have to sort of see. But I do feel like they need to add to that room because we saw what that room looked like against teams that had more than one good wide receiver. And that gave the Falcons a lot of problems, and you haven't really addressed that so far this offseason, I think is where I kind of stand on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, there's a cat scratching behind me there.
Whatever the cat was
threw me off there.
It's like, what is this cat going to do? But we will have to wait and see what the cat is going to do as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. We want to talk a little bit more about the Falcons special teams investments that might pay off because the NFL is changing their kickoff rule, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, there's nothing like watching your favorite teams live and in person, and getting tickets to see your favorite team shouldn't be stressful. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Game Time is making it easier to get tickets thanks to their feature, Game Time Picks. This feature is going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. With their panoramic seat views before you buy, no surprise fees at checkout that you can toggle on in the app, and their lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So one of the rule changes, no tush push, it gets all the oxygen in the room, but no one cares. Or at least I don't care. I can't speak for everybody else, but it's like, if they change it, great.
I don't care.
Don't change it. Who cares? Like, whatever. But one of the rule changes that is going through is that the NFL is changing the yard line marker for touchbacks. It was 30 yards, and now this year it will be 35 yards, which is with the idea of increasing the likelihood that teams will keep the ball in the field of play, and so therefore we'll get more returns. And the dynamic kickoff rule that the league instituted that didn't really do anything last year may actually do something this year. And so that makes it seem like, hey, the Falcons maybe we're a little prescient, little ahead of the curve with all these investments that they've made in the special teams, adding players like Mike Ford and our favorite Felipe Franks and Jamal Agnew, and it seemed like the Falcons were more interested in upgrading their special teams this offseason than maybe upgrading their defense. I know that may be a controversial take to some folks, but do you feel like this is one area where reluctantly, at least for me, I don't know about you, Dave, but reluctantly, you have to give the Falcons some praise because they seem to be ahead of the curve for once.
Yeah, I think so. I think special teams has been at least a partial priority under Marquise Williams. I think we've seen that consistently, that they do seem to add to this group, and I think there was maybe more pressure on them to do so after it was kind of a middling year. We saw a lot of pullback from Bradley Pinion. I thought obviously Younghoe Koo had a tough year by his standards. So like taking a look at the specialists made sense. Adding somebody like Agnew, who Williams is familiar with, makes a lot of sense. But then, yeah, maybe they were a little bit ahead of the game there because they have an inside man in Rich McKay, who everyone I know loves very much, listeners of the show. To know that it would make sense for them to make those kinds of investments to handle potentially a much higher volume of returns. So I do give them some credit, and I hope that we can at least talk about elite Falcons special teams if nothing else goes right this year, because that gives us something to hang our hat on.
I just imagining the hook that we're hanging our hat on is a very tiny,
very
hook,
small
but,
hook.
yes, but nonetheless, it is a hook. Yeah. I do also think this rule does mean that defense does become a little bit more important, though, because the distance that a team, if you do accidentally kick a touchback, the distance that a team now has to cover in order to get in a scoring position is like nothing now at this point in time, right? Where it's just like, if you start your drive off at the 35, you're like 30 yards away from being in field goal range. You're like 45 yards away from being in the red zone. We're talking about a handful of first downs now than what it used to be back in the day, where at least, you had to force teams to go like 50 yards or whatever to be in a similar position. And so the thing that I'm thinking about is the sort of, let's call it conservative, bend but don't break style of defense. I don't think can work in this current environment of football, where basically you're like 3 first downs away from giving up points. And so I'm curious, Dave, do you feel like this will be the spur for the Falcons to adopt maybe a little bit more of an aggressive defense now with Jeff Ulbrich as the new defensive coordinator? I think one of the criticisms of the Falcons defense, one of the frequent criticisms of the Falcons defense last year, was that they were a little too soft. So, are we going to get that hard-nosed defense now as a addition to, this increase in special teams, and hoping that you won't necessarily start teams off with that positive field position due to the coverage and whatnot? But what are your thoughts on how this impacts the defense and whatnot?
Yeah, I think philosophically they have to be more aggressive. And I think that, looking at the things that did go well a year ago, Caden Ellis sort of unleashed when they were able to do that. Maybe having a little bit more athleticism and youth up front after they were kind of creaky and slow-footed throughout much of last year. I think they know that was a problem. I think Jimmy Lake would still be here if they thought, it wasn't the philosophy, it was, just the personnel. The issue for me is, even if you're trying to be more aggressive out of necessity and a change in defensive coordinator, some changes in personnel, obviously we're well short of having, I think, the defense in place to play that style of ball. Like, to me, you're counting on so many steps forward. And I know we haven't been to the draft yet. And Arthur Blank just said today that, defense would be the focus in the draft. I know we'll probably get to that, but I think that their hearts are going to be in the right place on this, and I think they're going to be well aware of that fact that, even if you're doing a great job on special teams, it's a thin margin. What you did last year didn't work. The pass rush coming to life was the only reason, really, that the Falcons had a successful stretch. But it's one thing to say that, to believe that, to want to put that into place, and another to have the personnel on hand to execute a more aggressive, more effective defense without blown assignments and all sorts of problems. So I think we're well short of seeing what that actually looks like in a way that I would feel good about today.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it goes back to the cornerback conversation, because it's like,
Yeah.
if you're going to play a more aggressive style of defense, traditionally you tend to play a lot more man coverage, as a way to offset the fact that you're sending more pressure and whatnot. That's not a hard and fast rule. There's a lot more zone blitzes and all that stuff, but it is one of those things where I think you have to feel a lot more confident about the play of your secondary, because as you mentioned, late down the season when the Falcons pass rush was coming alive, um, you know, the one time it kind of failed them was in that Vikings game where they couldn't really cover those guys on the back end. You are going to face the Vikings again this year, as well as several other teams that also have multiple weapons. And so I do wonder, that to me leads to needing to invest in that cornerback position in addition to the pass rush, to try to get that so that you can play more of that aggressive style of defense, at least in theory and whatnot. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I think it is, and I think the flip from Justin Simmons to Jordan Fuller and whoever else they add to that safety room, because I don't think they're done, indicates that coverage is a little bit more of a priority. Just because I think Fuller is not known for his run defense, right? So you're importing him in the hopes that you can get that better on the back end, but obviously we're still, again, counting on improvement from in-house options, and a lot of nebulousness to kind of get to where you want to go there. But I do agree with the thought.
So speaking of nebulousness, let's talk about the Falcons draft plans, because it's been a long running gag on this podcast that they have to take an edge rusher in round one, and we'll run that by Dave Choate here to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, if he feels like that is an accurate assessment of the Falcons draft priorities, or could they zig while we expect them to zag. We'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as I mentioned, for several months now on this podcast, when we talk about what the Falcons are going to do in the first round, we have said that they are definitely taking an edge rusher, mostly because any other selection would be a completely unserious selection of this football team. It's not to say that they don't have other needs, but given the history of this team not having a pass rush, given that we all sat here a year ago thinking, oh, they're definitely going to take an edge rusher because they've ignored this obvious problem spot, and then they decided to go with Michael Penix, and they kind of paid the positives of Michael Penix. We all look forward to him being the savior, the Lisan Al Gaib of this franchise this upcoming season. But at the same time, there was a cost to that, which is that you had the worst pass rush in the NFL for basically 11 weeks. And so, like, you can't go down that road again, basically, is where I stand on that, Dave. But I'm curious, when you look ahead to the Falcons draft plans, are you just like, what are your thoughts on what they can do in round one?
Well, I think, for 10 years running or whatever it was, when I was doing the Falcons selection for the SB Nation mock draft, I chose like an edge rusher every single time, and it only actually happened maybe once. So I'm very much in favor of it. I hope that's what they do. They've neglected it for way too long. Leonard Floyd is a 1-year solution, and even if he wasn't, that room is so far from complete that you could easily sink multiple picks into it, like day one and day two, and I'd feel a lot better finally. But I will not be surprised if they do zig, and we end up with a corner, a safety, God forbid, I've seen those rumors, a tackle. I can see them thinking about it. 5 years in a row drafting offense in the first round would almost be a meme at that point. I don't know how else to describe it. Like you're just punching us in the face on purpose. But my hope, my wish, and my expectation is that yes, it's going to be an edge rusher in the first round. But I do think that we've seen that what the Falcons mean when they say best player available is very often not an edge rusher is what they mean by that. So it would still not surprise me, even with the options that'll be available, where they're picking, the huge gaping need there, if it is one of those other positions ultimately.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Like, I'm not necessarily in love with the edge rush options in round one. So, like, you could convince me that, like, oh, well, there will be a better player at another position than whatever the edge rusher the Falcons take at 15 or wherever they wind up picking. Like, that's not, but like to me, because of the baggage that we're talking about, it's like, I don't care about all that. Like, get me somebody, like, in it's the idea of, like, if you had that thought process going into this, like, then you probably should have been more aggressive adding a younger edge rusher than Leonard Floyd in free agency than necessarily, as you mentioned, getting a guy that's, towards the end of his career or really at the end of his career, and it's just a 1-year solution. That to me would just be terrible. The Falcons are like, yeah, this is our main, and then we'll wait till day 2 or day 3 or whatever to take an edge rusher.
Oh, great God.
Like, what are we doing? Like, but I know, Dave, you don't do the deep film dives or anything like that on some of these prospects, but are there a couple of prospects at a non-edge rusher position that you are at least circling as like, okay, I won't like it, but like at least I will be able to get over it a lot sooner if they were to maybe land one of these guys or something like that?
Yeah, the two names that in my fairly casual watching and looking at rumors and so forth, I do think Malaki Starks and I do think Will Johnson would both be appealing to me. And I think, they have Jesse Bates, they have AJ Terrell, but adding another potentially elite young player to the secondary where we're talking about you need a higher level of aggression. Maybe you can talk yourself into saying, we have a bunch of young guys up front we really like. We think they're going to do well in the short term. We all know that something's going to fall apart there, but let's say for the sake of argument, those are guys that I could see the Falcons taking at 15 and being happy with after the initial, this is not an edge rusher, shock and anger kind of wears off.
Yeah. We'll see. Is there a particular edge rusher that you have circled at that spot that you would prefer over some of the other ones?
Not really. I've seen obviously the link to Mike Green over and over again. I really like the idea of him. I think I like the idea of maybe avenging the ghost of Vic Beasley with another hyper athletic, bendy edge rusher who maybe will not fizzle out in quite the same way. So he would be somebody I'd be interested in. But ultimately, kind of to go back to what you said earlier, if it's a good edge rusher at 15, I'm going to have a hard time being too mad about almost anyone, unless they take a guy that is widely projected to go in the 5th round, which you never know. You never really know.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I'm trying to stack sort of my edge rusher board at this point in time. I think Mike Green is inching towards the top of it. But at this point, it's just like, just take a guy. Like, even if I don't think that guy's the best option, like, I don't care. Like, just take a guy.
Do something. Yeah.
So, last question I have for you, Dave. You excited about the expansion of the throwback uniform usage this upcoming season?
Not as excited as Evan Birchfield is, but it's he asked if we could put a banner up on the site, and I did say no for this one, but maybe if they unveil new uniforms. But as somebody who does love the old logo, loves the old uniforms, I am excited about it, and I'm still kind of hoping that the 4 times a year turns into something more permanent in the older stuff. But I am, in fact, after nearly 20 years of this, pretty old, so that's probably to be expected.
There you go. Well, Dave, let the people know, some of the stuff you're working on, some of the stuff coming their way over at the Falcoholic and where they can hit you up.
Yeah, just was taking a look today and then a little bit later this week, kind of which way arrows are pointing for projected Falcon starters, special teams, offense, defense after free agency, before the draft. We'll do that exercise again after the draft. And then we're really getting in full swing for draft season. So we'll have prospect profiles, lots of mock drafts. Everybody loves mock drafts. And the like coming up soon over at thefalcoholic.com. And you can find me at the Falcoholic on both Twitter/X and Blue Sky.
There you guys have it. All right. We'll be back with more Locked On Falcons tomorrow. Make sure you're check us out as your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, where Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson will get you guys geared up for all those edge rushers, all those non-edge rushers that the Falcons may be taking in the first round. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.